The Grand Concordance Institute for Xenocompatibility was, by any measure, the most serene place in the known galaxy. Its corridors were carved from living, crystalline flora that chimed softly in response to shifting gravitic tides. The air, a carefully calibrated cocktail of 16 different atmospheres, carried the scent of nebular dust and cloned Terran lavender, a scent proven to be statistically calming to over 300 sentient species. It was a place of peace, a monument to the idea that with enough understanding, enough patience, and enough funding, anyone could get along with anyone else. It was, in essence, a cosmic kindergarten, albeit one where a temper tantrum could liquefy the walls. Presiding over this delicate ecosystem of enforced tranquility was High Proctor Valerius of the Cthar. Valerius was a being of immense intellect and even more immense physical frailty. His species had evolved past the vulgar necessity of robust skeletons, instead supporting their elongated, six-limbed frames with personal anti-gravity fields and a powerful sense of intellectual superiority. His skin was the color of polished obsidian, and his three eyes, arranged in a vertical line down his face, blinked in slow, asynchronous waves, giving him an expression of perpetual, thoughtful condescension. He saw the universe as a complex equation, and he was quite certain he was only a few variables away from solving it entirely. His frequent companion, and the walking embodiment of a variable he could not quite place, was Warlord Grusk of the Grolnok. Where Valerius was a whisper of intellect, Grusk was a roar of physicality. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, his body was a fortress of overlapping chitinous plates, granite-like muscle, and barely contained aggression. The Grolnok had carved their empire from the bones of their enemies, and Grusk's personal philosophy was that any problem that couldn't be solved by the application of overwhelming force was probably not a real problem to begin with. He was at the Institute on a mandatory diplomatic sabbatical after his last negotiation had ended with him using the peace treaty table as a projectile weapon. He considered the entire establishment a pastel-colored prison, and Valerius an insufferable talking noodle. Together, they represented two of the three great pillars of galactic power, mind and might. The third pillar, commerce, was represented by the Ferenga-like Glyptons, who were currently busy trying to sell extended warranties on the Institute's air scrubbers. Valerius and Grusk were observing the Institute's most prized asset, the creature that made all their work possible, the amalgam. It was a creature of pure empathy, a biological nexus of emotional energy. Physically, it resembled a large, fluffy, six-legged capybara with the soulful, shimmering eyes of a nebula. It was called the amalgam because it could form a temporary psychic bond with any sentient being, perfectly reflecting and soothing their emotional state. It was the ultimate therapy animal, a living beacon of harmony, and an impossibly expensive piece of biological art. "Behold, Warlord," Valerius intoned, his voice a series of melodic clicks and whistles that the universal translator rendered into smooth, academic prose. The amalgam is in its quiescent state. Its psychic field is a perfect mirror of the Institute's ambient tranquility. It is the living proof that all beings, no matter how disparate, can find a common emotional ground. Grusk snorted, a sound like rocks grinding together in a landslide. "It's a fluffy rock, Valerius. It sits there. My battlegrock sits there, too, but at least it can be used as a siege engine in a pinch. Can this thing breach a fortified bunker? Its purpose is not to breach bunkers, but to prevent them from ever being built," Valerius replied, his third eye closing in a gesture of profound pity for the Grolnok's limited worldview. "It has successfully pacified enraged Cthar matriarchs, calmed Glypton trade feuds, and even induced a state of peaceful contemplation in a hive of sentient, hyper-aggressive space fungi. Its value is beyond measure." "So it's a professional hugger," Grusk grumbled, tapping one of his massive talons against the transparent containment field. "A very expensive, very fluffy hugger." This was the state of the galaxy, a delicate balance between those who thought and those who fought, all of them orbiting their shared belief in their own species' inherent superiority. And then there were the humans. Humanity was a galactic punchline. They were newcomers, a loud, chaotic species from a ridiculously hostile planet in the galactic boondocks. They were known for their flimsy biology, their bizarrely emotional art, and their inexplicable tendency to pack bond with anything, including inanimate cleaning robots. They had no natural armor, no psionic abilities, no venom, no claws to speak of. They were, as Valerius had once written in a widely circulated treatise, a species of evolutionary compromises, held together by irrational optimism and adhesive bandages. They were not considered a serious player on the galactic stage. They were a curiosity, which was why the arrival of the new exchange specialist was met with such a profound lack of enthusiasm. His name was Jake Miller. He was assigned to the Institute's Xenocare division, a position most assumed was a clerical error or a misguided attempt at inclusivity. Valerius and Grusk watched his transport shuttle dock from a high observation deck, their opinions already firmly set. The shuttle door hissed open, and Jake emerged. He was aggressively average. He was of medium height, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a face that seemed incapable of holding any expression more threatening than mild concern. He wore the standard-issue beige Institute jumpsuit, which did him no favors. It hung on his soft, unarmored frame like a sack. He carried a simple, battered-looking bag over one shoulder and squinted at the Institute's brilliant, synthesized sunlight. "Observe," Valerius murmured, one of his slender, three-fingered hands gesturing towards the human. The primate form. Bipedal, endoskeletal. A fundamentally inefficient design. All its vital organs are clustered together on its vulnerable anterior side. A single, well-placed strike would be catastrophic. A single, poorly placed strike would be catastrophic, Grusk corrected. I saw a recording of one of their sporting contests. They call it hockey. It involved them voluntarily sliding across frozen water on sharpened blades while hitting a hard projectile at each other. Several of them lost their teeth. They seemed to consider this a positive outcome. The warlord shook his massive head. They are insane. Fragile, yet utterly insane. A volatile combination, Valerius agreed. Their history is a litany of self-inflicted disasters followed by periods of frantic, irrational cooperation. They possess a primitive, brute force intellect, capable of impressive feats of engineering, but utterly lacking in philosophical nuance. They went from throwing rocks to splitting the atom in the geological blink of an eye, a developmental trajectory akin to giving a hyperactive infant a plasma cannon. It's a miracle they haven't rendered their own homeworld uninhabitable. They're trying, from what I've read, Grusk noted dryly. As Jake walked towards the main entrance, he stumbled slightly on a perfectly flat section of the walkway. He caught himself with a little shuffle, a gesture of such mundane clumsiness that Valerius felt a wave of second-hand embarrassment. This was the creature that was supposed to contribute to the most advanced xenological institute in the galaxy? This soft, unstable biped? It was absurd. The institute had specialists who could communicate with silicon life forms through harmonic resonance, and others who could biosculpt new limbs for injured fauna. And now they had a human, whose primary species-wide skill seemed to be tripping over things and then apologizing to the floor. Jake was greeted by a junior administrator, a willowy insectoid being named Pliax. Jake smiled, a bearing of his blunt, flat teeth that was a universal sign of aggression in over 50 species, but which Pliax, who had studied the human briefing, correctly interpreted as a gesture of friendliness. Jake extended his hand. Pliax, after a moment of hesitation, reciprocated by extending a delicate, chitinous feeler, which Jake gently shook. "Look at that," Grusk rumbled. "The ritual of manual grappling. They do that to establish dominance, I'm told. A contest of crushing strength. I believe in this context it is a greeting," Valerius corrected smoothly. Though with humans, the line between friendly greeting and physical assault is often alarmingly thin. Their social interactions are a cosmic garage sale of anxiety, posturing, and arbitrary gestures. It is fascinating, in a horrifying sort of way. The tour began. Jake was shown the various habitats, the state-of-the-art veterinary labs, the psychoacoustics chambers. He nodded politely, asked simple questions, and generally looked like a tourist who had won a competition. Valerius and Grusk followed at a discreet distance, their silent judgment hanging in the air. They watched as Jake was shown the Gralnokian razor beast enclosure. The creature within was a maelstrom of claws and fury, a predator so perfectly evolved for violence that it made Grusk look like a cuddly pet. Jake just watched it for a moment, then turned to Plix. Does he get much enrichment? Jake asked. He looks a little bored. Plix fluttered its antennae in confusion. Bored? Its hormonal state is locked at maximum rage, as is optimal for its species. Yeah, but sustained rage is stressful on the cardiovascular system, Jake said casually. You should try giving it one of those big rubber balls with treats inside. My neighbor's pit bull loves them. Keeps him from eating the sofa. Valerius and Grusk exchanged a look. Pit bull? Sofa? The words were translated, but the context was utterly alien. They were comparing a Gralnokian razor beast, a creature that could disembowel a small moon, to some kind of domestic earth animal. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was almost impressive. The human was not merely ignorant. He was operating on a level of cosmic provincialism that was breathtaking in its scope. He was a villager from a forgotten swamp, wandering through the Emperor's palace and offering advice on how to fix the plumbing. Their tour was destined to conclude, as all tours did, at the central habitat of the amalgam. It was the heart of the Institute, a massive, tranquil biosphere designed to be a perfect utopia for the creature. But as they approached, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The gentle, chiming hum of the crystalline flora was gone, replaced by a discordant, high-frequency whine. The air no longer smelled of lavender, but of ozone and fear. Plix stopped abruptly, its antennae twitching violently. Something is wrong. The amalgam. It is broadcasting a distress signal of the highest magnitude. They rounded the final corner, and the scene before them was one of controlled chaos. Institute specialists, beings of immense psychic and technical power, were recoiling from the amalgam's enclosure. The transparent containment field, normally crystal clear, was now flickering, struggling to contain the waves of pure psychic terror that were pouring out of the habitat. Inside, the amalgam was no longer a serene, fluffy ball. It was a writhing knot of fur and panic, thrashing against the walls of its biosphere. Its shimmering, nebular eyes were squeezed shut, and from its body pulsed waves of undiluted horror, so potent that even the non-psionic Grusk could feel the hairs on his carapace stand on end. It was the psychic equivalent of a full-volume fire alarm, siren, and infant scream, all blended together and aimed directly at the brain. Valerius rushed forward, his personal anti-gravity field whining with the strain. What happened? Report. A core specialist, a silicon being whose crystalline body was currently vibrating with sympathetic distress, projected its thoughts. Containment breach. Sector Gamma. We were interfacing the amalgam's empathy field with a new specimen for cataloging. A void shrieker, a collective gasp, or the species equivalent thereof, went through the assembled staff. Even Grusk took an involuntary step back. Void shriekers were not creatures. They were localized events of pure malevolence. Found only in the dead spaces between galaxies, they were non-corporeal entities of hunger and fear. They didn't kill you. They made you experience the heat death of the universe in your own mind until your brain simply dissolved. You exposed the galaxy's most powerful empath to a being of pure psychic horror? Valerius shrieked, his voice losing its academic calm and becoming a series of panicked clicks. By the first equation, what were you thinking? It was a shielded, juvenile specimen. The protocols were followed. The core projected, its own thoughts fracturing with the amalgam's psychic feedback. Something went wrong. The shrieker's terror, it imprinted on the amalgam. The shrieker is contained, but the amalgam is now locked in a feedback loop. It is broadcasting the shrieker's essence. It is breaking. The situation was dire. The Institute's best empaths tried to project calming thoughts, only to be thrown back, their own minds reeling from the sheer psychic toxicity. Engineers tried to dampen the field, but it was like trying to catch a tsunami in a teacup. The amalgam, the symbol of galactic peace, was becoming a psychic weapon that threatened to drive the entire Institute insane. They were losing it. Desperation was a foul taste in the filtered air. Every expert, every specialist, every being with a doctorate in esoteric disciplines had tried and failed. The psychic screaming continued, a relentless assault on the senses. It was in this moment of utter failure that Plix, its mind frayed and its logic processors skipping, had a completely irrational thought. Its multifaceted eyes landed on the new human, who was standing near the back, watching the chaos with a strange, thoughtful expression on his face. He wasn't writhing in agony or shielding his head. He just looked concerned. The human, Pliax chittered, the idea sounding absurd even as it formed. Specialist Miller. Let him try. Valerius turned his 3 eyes towards Pliax, his expression one of utter disbelief. Let the primitive try? What could it possibly do? Wiggle its fingers and make cooing noises? Do not be ridiculous, Pliax. Its mind is a blunt instrument. It would be shattered in an instant. We have tried everything else. Pliax buzzed, a touch of hysteria in its voice. He is a xenocare specialist. This is xeno, and it needs care. Grusk, surprisingly, grunted in agreement. The fragile thing is just standing there. He doesn't seem to be affected by the noise. At this point, what's the harm? If his head explodes, at least the screaming might be briefly drowned out. Valerius considered this. It was the logic of the truly desperate. Every conventional and unconventional method had failed. The amalgam was minutes away from psychically tearing itself apart. Throwing the human at the problem was like trying to fix a malfunctioning hyperdrive by hitting it with a rock. But they were out of rocks, and the hyperdrive was about to go critical. With a sigh that sounded like a deflating balloon, Valerius gave a curt nod. Very well. Let the primate have its moment. Open a channel to his comm unit. Tell him to do what he can. Jake's cheap, standard-issue comm bead chirped in his ear. He listened for a moment, his expression unchanged. He looked at the thrashing, screaming creature in the enclosure. He looked at the frantic, panicking aliens. Then he nodded, a simple, human gesture of acceptance. He turned to Pliax. Can you lower the containment field just enough for me to get in? And turn off that awful alarm noise. It's not helping anyone. The awful alarm noise was, of course, the psychic death scream of the amalgam. The fact that the human perceived it as a simple, external sound was the first clue that something was deeply wrong with their understanding of the species. A Kthar engineer, trembling, lowered a small section of the field. Jake took a deep breath and stepped through. He was now in the cage with the monster. The moment he entered the habitat, the ambient psychic pressure should have crushed his primitive mind into a fine paste. Valerius braced himself for the inevitable, gruesome result. Grusk leaned forward, morbidly curious. But Jake didn't collapse. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the light, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jumpsuit. He looked for all the world like a man who had just walked into his garage to find a raccoon in the trash cans. Annoyed, perhaps, but not terrified. The amalgam, sensing a new presence, thrashed violently in his direction, unleashing a focused wave of pure terror that had caused a decorated Grolnok battle shaman to enter a temporary coma. The wave washed over Jake. He blinked. He then made a soft, shushing noise. "Hey now," he said, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly unremarkable. "Easy there, big fella. It's okay. You're okay." Valerius's 3 jaws dropped. Grusk's mandibles clicked in confusion. The human was talking to it. He was using primitive, vocalized sounds, as if it were a disobedient pet. He wasn't using psionics, or pheromones, or harmonic frequencies. He was using his voice, and he was using a tone one might use to calm a frightened horse. Jake took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't look directly at the amalgam. Instead, he looked slightly to the side, a classic predator avoidance technique from his own world that was completely unknown to the assembled galactic geniuses. "It's loud in here, isn't it?" he said, continuing his soft monologue. "Lots of scary noises. That's all right. We'll get it sorted." The amalgam's thrashing lessened slightly. It was still broadcasting terror, but there was a new element mixed in, confusion. This new being wasn't reacting like the others. It wasn't screaming back with its mind. It wasn't recoiling in fear. Its mental presence was quiet. It was a null space, a void. To the amalgam, whose entire existence was a symphony of psychic noise, Jake's mind was a soundproofed room. It was the most comforting, most novel sensation the creature had ever experienced. Jake took another slow step. Then he did something that defied all logic, all protocol, all sense of self-preservation. He sat down. He sat on the floor of the habitat, cross-legged, about 10 feet from the terrified creature. He sighed, a weary, put-upon sound. "Long day," he muttered, mostly to himself. Then he reached into a pocket of his jumpsuit and pulled out a small, metallic object. It was silver, with a little red cap. He fiddled with it for a moment, and a small, controlled flame, a primitive chemical reaction, bloomed at the end. A fire starter, Grusk breathed, his voice filled with a strange reverence. He brings a weapon into the lair of the beast. But Jake didn't use it as a weapon. He pulled out a small, white stick, placed it between his lips, and lit the end with the flame. He inhaled deeply, then blew out a cloud of blue-gray smoke. The acrid smell of burning earth tobacco filled the habitat, a scent of alien chemistry and carcinogens. The act was so mundane, so profoundly out of place, that it stunned the onlookers into silence. In the middle of a psychic apocalypse, the human was taking a smoke break. He just sat there, smoking his cigarette, not looking at the amalgam. He started to hum. It was a simple, repetitive, tuneless little melody, the kind of thing a person hums when they're bored while waiting for a bus. The amalgam had stopped thrashing entirely. It was now crouched in the corner, its shimmering eyes cracked open, watching the human. The psychic screaming had dropped to a low, anxious thrum. The quiet mind was still there. It was solid, unmoving, safe. Slowly, tentatively, the amalgam began to move. It uncurled itself, one fluffy limb at a time. It crept across the floor of the habitat, low to the ground, like a predator stalking its prey. But its psychic field wasn't broadcasting aggression. It was broadcasting a desperate, searching curiosity. It approached the seated human. Jake didn't move. He just took another slow drag from his cigarette and hummed his stupid little tune. The amalgam reached him. It paused, inches away from his leg. It extended its head, sniffing at his beige trousers. It nudged him, a gentle, questioning touch. Jake finally turned his head and looked at the creature. He smiled, a small, tired smile. "Hey there," he said softly. "See? Not so bad." He reached out his hand, slowly, palm up, and held it out for the creature to inspect. The amalgam flinched back for a second, then leaned in and sniffed his fingers. And then, the climax. The moment that would shatter 1,000 years of galactic sociological theory. The amalgam, the priceless empathic nexus, the creature that communed with the minds of star gods and crystalline philosophers, pushed its head firmly into Jake's hand and began to emit a low, rumbling, vibratory sound. A purr. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contentment. Jake, as if this were the most normal thing in the world, began to scratch the amalgam behind one of its feathery ear analogs. "That's the spot, huh?" he murmured. The amalgam's purr grew louder, and it practically melted, collapsing into a boneless, fluffy heap against Jake's leg. It then proceeded to crawl, with a distinct lack of dignity, directly into Jake's lap. It curled up, nuzzled its face into his stomach, and fell soundly asleep, its psychic field now broadcasting a gentle, warm wave of deep security and affection so powerful it made several of the onlookers feel a sudden, inexplicable urge to call their mothers. The silence in the observation room was absolute. Valerius stared, his 3 eyes blinking in perfect, horrified synchrony. Grusk stood as still as a statue, his warrior's mind utterly failing to process what it had just witnessed. The human hadn't just pacified the creature. He had tamed it. In less than 10 minutes. With a cigarette and a bad tune. Finally, Valerius found his voice. It was a weak, trembling series of clicks. He activated the calm, specialist Miller. "What? How? Explain." Now, Jake looked up at the observation window. He gently shifted the sleeping, multi-million credit alien miracle in his lap. "Explain what?" he asked, taking one last puff of his cigarette before stubbing it out on the sole of his boot. The little guy was having a panic attack. You were all shouting at it with your brains, which was just making it worse. It needed a quiet place to ride it out. "A panic attack," Valerius stammered. "You diagnosed a creature of pure psychic energy with a primitive mammalian anxiety disorder. Looks like a duck, quacks like a duck," Jake said with a shrug. It was mirroring the fear from that shrieker thing. It's an empath, right? A psychic sponge. It wasn't the source of the fear, it was the amplifier. You were all trying to fight the echo, not the source. All I did was give it something else to focus on. Something quiet. Quiet. Grusk's voice boomed over the calm, shaking the observation deck. "Human, your mind should have been torn asunder. We felt the psychic assault from behind a shielded wall. You were at its epicenter. Jake chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Assault? That was just noise. Annoying, sure. Like a car alarm that won't shut off. But it wasn't directed. It wasn't personal. He looked down at the sleeping amalgam, scratching its head gently. This is going to sound weird to you guys, but where I come from, our minds are our own. We don't have telepathy. We don't broadcast. Our thoughts are locked inside our skulls. It's a closed system. To a creature like this, that's used to a constant barrage of psychic input, my head must feel like absolute silence. A vacuum. And right now, silence is exactly what it needed. Valerius felt the foundations of his entire worldview begin to crumble. A closed system. A mind that did not broadcast. It was a biological absurdity. But your calmness, your lack of fear, to face such a terrifying force with such nonchalance. It is not logical. It defies all known psychological models of prey species. This was it. The moment Jake finally decided to explain. He leaned back against the wall of the habitat, the amalgam snoring softly in his lap. You guys have it all backward about us, he began, his voice taking on a slightly more serious, almost weary tone. You look at me, you see a soft, squishy biped with no armor and no natural weapons. You see prey, and you're not wrong. On my world, pretty much everything is a predator. And we're on the menu. He paused, letting that sink in. You think that void shrieker is scary? I'm sure it is. But its fear is conceptual, abstract. On Earth, fear has teeth. Big, sharp, pointy ones. We have land predators that can outrun our vehicles. We have marine predators that are basically torpedoes with a mouth full of razor blades. We have tiny insects whose venom can liquefy your internal organs. We have snakes that can kill you with a single bite before you even know you've been bitten. We have bacteria and viruses, invisible little monsters that can wipe out entire continents. Our planet's weather tries to kill us with wind and water and ice and fire. The very ground we stand on occasionally tries to swallow us whole. The star we orbit is constantly bathing us in radiation that gives us cancer. He took a breath. The aliens in the observation deck were silent, hanging on his every word. You guys live on garden worlds. Stable orbits, predictable ecologies, mild gravity. Earth is not a garden. It's a high-security prison for homicidal maniacs, and we're the inmates. We call it a death world, and we're the apex predator on it. Not because we're the strongest or the fastest, but because we are the meanest, most stubborn, and most adaptable bastards in the whole damn zoo. You see this? Jake said, pinching the skin on the back of his hand. This soft, weak flesh. It's packed with sweat glands. It means I can shed heat better than almost any other animal. We evolved to run our prey to death over hours, or even days. We're persistence hunters. We don't give up. Ever. A Grolnok might be stronger, but I can keep going long after your muscles have flooded with lactic acid. We will simply outlast you. Grusk shifted uncomfortably. The concept of being out-stubborned was alien to him. And our minds, Jake continued, a faint, ironic smile on his lips. You think they're primitive because they're quiet. That's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a survival trait. It's called compartmentalization. When a 1,200-pound grizzly bear is charging at you, you don't have time for a psychic debate or an existential crisis. You have to take your fear, your screaming, pants-wetting terror, and put it in a little box in the back of your head. You lock the box, and you deal with the problem. You focus. The psychic screaming from this little guy? I just put it in the box. Filed it under things that are trying to kill me, but not with teeth. It's a very crowded box. He gestured around the pristine, sterile habitat. You guys treat this place like a laboratory, but you're dealing with an animal. A scared one. And humans? Well, we have a long and complicated history with animals. We've been taming the things that tried to eat us for 30,000 years. We took wolves, vicious pack-hunting killers, and we turned them into poodles. We took giant, angry grass eaters and taught them to pull our plows. We call it a pack bond. We make them part of our family. We convince them that we are the leader, the alpha, and that if they stick with us, they'll be safe. It's not a trick. It's an honest promise. And animals, even psychic alien ones, they understand that promise on a primal level. He looked down at the amalgam, which nuzzled deeper into his lap. This little fellow wasn't a scientific curiosity having a psychic malfunction. He was a scared dog hiding under the porch during a thunderstorm. He didn't need a scientist. He needed a friend. Someone to sit with him in the dark until the storm passed. The monologue was over. The explanation, so simple and yet so profoundly earth-shattering, hung in the silent room. Valerius was leaning against a console for support, his 3 eyes wide with a dawning, existential horror. All his theories, all his papers on human frailty, all his condescending assumptions, they were not just wrong, they were spectacularly, fundamentally wrong. He hadn't been studying a primitive prey species. He had been studying the escaped warden of a planetary asylum. Grusk's reaction was different. There was no horror in his eyes. There was something else. A flicker of something Valerius had never seen in the warlord before. It was respect. A deep, primal, and deeply unsettled respect. The kind of respect one predator affords another, more dangerous predator. A human wasn't a fragile weakling. A human was a creature that had looked evolution in the eye on a planet full of monsters and had won through sheer, bloody-minded persistence. They tamed wolves. They made friends with things that had teeth. The aftermath was a bureaucratic nightmare and a scientific revolution. The amalgam, now unofficially named Fuzzy by Jake, refused to leave his side. It would not go back into its habitat. It would only sleep in Jake's quarters, curled up on a pillow next to his bed. It followed him down the corridors of the Institute like a fluffy, 6-legged shadow. The priceless symbol of galactic harmony had become the personal pet of a junior-grade human caretaker from a backwater planet. Legal teams from 3 different sectors had simultaneous aneurysms trying to figure out the paperwork. Jake, for his part, took it all in stride. He was given a massive promotion, a corner office he didn't use, and a research grant he didn't know what to do with. Most days, he could be found in the staff canteen, trying to teach Fuzzy how to fetch a crumpled-up napkin. The amalgam was terrible at it, but it seemed to enjoy the attention. Weeks later, Valerius and Grusk were once again on the observation deck, watching Jake and Fuzzy in the main recreational garden. Jake was throwing a brightly colored ball. Fuzzy would chase it, nudge it with its nose, then immediately get distracted and come back for more head scratches. "I have rewritten my entire thesis on humanity," Valerius said quietly, his voice hollow. "I previously classified them as a Type 2 fragile sapient. I have since reclassified them as a Type 12 Death World persistence predator. It is the highest threat classification possible. It is a category I had to invent this morning." "Threat," Grusk rumbled, his eyes fixed on the scene below. "No, High Proctor. Not a threat. A fact. A terrible, undeniable fact of the universe." Jake was now lying on the grass. Fuzzy, the ultimate empath, was draped over his chest, purring like a fusion engine. Jake was showing it something on his datapad. From the tinny audio, it sounded like videos of Earth cats falling off furniture. The amalgam seemed fascinated. "They evolved in a crucible of relentless lethality," Valerius whispered, more to himself than to Grusk. "Their weaknesses, their lack of armor, their quiet minds, their absurd emotional bonding, they weaponized them. They turned fragility into the ultimate camouflage. The entire galaxy sees them as harmless, and they encourage it. It is the greatest strategic deception in cosmic history." Grusk nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the human. He had finally solved the puzzle of humanity. They weren't fragile creatures who acted insane. They were terrifyingly resilient creatures who acted normal. And their definition of normal was what made them so profoundly dangerous. "They are not conquerors, Valerius," the warlord said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that held no trace of his former arrogance. "They are tamers. They do not need to shatter our bunkers with force." He gestured with a massive talon towards the man and his pet below. "They will simply walk in, sit on the floor, and convince the monster inside to fetch their slippers.